Welcome. Tonight's story takes us deep into Louisiana, 1841, where history recorded a level of cruelty so disturbing it was almost erased from memory. The slave brothers who killed not out of survival, not out of revenge, but for what witnesses described as pleasure. This case is built from court fragments, plantation records, and testimonies that took an enormous amount of time to verify and cross-check. So before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe if you value deeply researched, true historical stories that most people have never heard. Your support is what allows these forgotten truths to be told. The origins of the slave brothers trace back to a stretch of rural Louisiana, where brutality was woven into daily life long before the first body was ever found. They were born into bondage on a sugar plantation that was already infamous for its cruelty, a place where punishment came quicker than mercy, and survival depended on learning when to speak and when to disappear. Their mother, whose name appears only once in plantation records, worked the fields until the day she collapsed from exhaustion. She was buried without ceremony, and the boys were separated for months afterward, each sent to different quarters to be broken into obedience. That separation, many later believed, was where something inside them fractured permanently. When they were reunited years later, the brothers were no longer children. They had grown up under whips, chains, and constant fear, watching men die from overwork and women vanish into the big house, never returning the same. Violence was not something they learned later. It was the first language spoken to them. Overseers ruled through terror, using public punishments as lessons. A single mistake could mean mutilation or death, and the brothers witnessed it all with unblinking eyes. Other enslaved people later testified that while most children cried or looked away, these two watched silently, absorbing every detail. As they grew older, they were assigned tasks that placed them close to danger: night patrols, animal slaughter, hauling bodies of those who died in the fields. Death became routine, stripped of ceremony or emotion. One overseer reportedly joked that the brothers had iron stomachs, able to handle what others could not. But beneath that reputation was something darker. Fellow workers noticed the brothers rarely spoke, even to each other, yet seemed bound by an unspoken understanding. They moved together, worked together, and when separated, became noticeably agitated. Their environment offered no sense of right or wrong beyond obedience and punishment. Violence was rewarded when it enforced order and ignored when it harmed those deemed disposable. In that world, the line between sanctioned cruelty and personal desire blurred. The brothers learned early that pain could be inflicted without consequence, as long as the victim had no voice. Over time, what began as survival hardened into something else entirely. The fear that once kept them quiet slowly transformed into a sense of control they had never known. Plantation journals described them as efficient and unnervingly calm. One entry mentions that after a fellow enslaved man was beaten to death, the brothers were ordered to dispose of the body. They returned hours later without visible distress, their clothes clean, their expressions unchanged. That detail stood out to the plantation owner, who noted it as unusual but never questioned further. In a system built on dehumanization, emotional emptiness was mistaken for obedience. There were early warning signs that something had gone wrong. Small animals were found dead near the quarters where the brothers slept, their deaths unexplained. Tools went missing and reappeared stained. When questioned, the brothers remained silent, eyes fixed on the ground, offering no resistance, no explanation. Because enslaved people were rarely believed over overseers, and because violence against them was considered unremarkable, these incidents were dismissed as superstition or coincidence. The brothers' bond deepened in isolation. They had no family left, no future to imagine, no justice to hope for. All they had was each other, and the lessons the plantation had carved into them. Power belonged to those who took it, and suffering was meaningless unless it served someone stronger. In that twisted moral vacuum, empathy withered. Pain became ordinary, fear became fuel. By the time the first human deaths occurred under suspicious circumstances, the brothers were already shaped by years of normalized brutality. They were not born monsters, as later headlines would suggest. They were products of a system that rewarded cruelty, erased accountability, and stripped people of humanity until violence felt natural. Understanding their origins does not excuse what followed, but it reveals how such horror could take root unnoticed. When investigators later tried to reconstruct how two men could take so many lives without immediate suspicion, they returned again and again to those early years, to the plantation, to the punishments, to the silence. The brothers did not emerge from nowhere. They were forged slowly, deliberately, by a world where death was routine and mercy was weakness. And long before the killings began, Louisiana had already taught them that life was cheap. Suffering was invisible, and no one was coming to stop them. The first unexplained deaths on the plantation were subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss as accidents or the natural hazards of life in 1841 Louisiana. The sugar fields were grueling and unforgiving. Disease, snake bites, and drownings were tragically common. Yet, for those who worked and lived closely with the brothers, a pattern began to emerge that could not be ignored. Animals and small children died under strange circumstances near the brothers' quarters. Chickens were found decapitated or gutted without cause. Dogs disappeared, and a neighbor's child once vanished while playing near the edge of the fields, only to be found lifeless in a shallow ditch hours later. At first, overseers and owners shrugged off these incidents as misfortune. Life on a plantation was harsh, after all. But the frequency and proximity to the brothers started raising unease. The earliest documented human death directly linked to them was an enslaved man named Tobias, a field hand who had been seen arguing with the older brother over a minor mistake in the cane harvest. Tobias was found the next morning under a pile of cane, his neck broken, though no one admitted to witnessing the act. Some said the brothers were nearby when the body was discovered, standing silently as if observing an experiment rather than a tragedy. Fellow workers whispered about their cold, unblinking expressions, a stare that seemed to measure the fear in others. At that point, the community began to notice a strange correlation. The first death was almost always preceded by a specific sound, a low hum or soft mutterings from the brothers as they worked in the fields. No one dared confront them, though, fearing both reprisal from the overseers and something more inexplicably sinister. Soon, the deaths escalated. Livestock began to die mysteriously in the pens, crops sabotaged in subtle but destructive ways, and more enslaved workers met violent ends that seemed random yet shared a hidden signature. Witnesses described the brothers' methodical behavior. They would isolate a target, ensure no one else was watching, and then strike quickly, leaving the body in a position that appeared staged, almost ceremonial. Some plantation records, painstakingly reconstructed later, hint that the killings were not impulsive but deliberate, carried out with a kind of detached precision. They weren't just surviving, they were experimenting, testing their control over life and death. The surrounding community's reactions ranged from unease to fear. Enslaved workers began to avoid the brothers entirely, speaking in hushed tones about their uncanny ability to anticipate danger. Some reported nightmares of the brothers' faces emerging from the shadows, grinning coldly, their actions replayed in disturbing detail. Even the overseers, who were used to brutality, noted an unsettling calm about the brothers, a calm that made those around them anxious without understanding why. One entry in a plantation ledger described how a young girl fainted at the sight of the brothers, though they had done her no harm, an observation repeated by others who sensed something deeply unnatural. Attempts to rationalize the deaths often fell short. When an independent doctor was called to investigate one of the earlier fatalities, he reported that Tobias's injuries could have been accidental, but the precision and positioning of the wounds suggested intention. No tools were found nearby, and the angle of impact implied knowledge of anatomy, a knowledge neither brother was formally taught. The doctor's notes, buried for decades, described a calculated cruelty that was beyond what ordinary men or children could commit. It was the first official recognition that these deaths were no accidents, that the brothers had moved from the role of passive participants in plantation violence to active orchestrators of it. Word of the deaths eventually spread beyond the immediate plantation, carried by traveling laborers and merchants. Other slaveholders in Louisiana began to whisper about the two brothers who seemed to bring death wherever they went. Rumors grew that the brothers had a strange fascination with the act of killing itself, that it was almost a game to them. Local authorities were still slow to intervene, partly due to the lack of direct evidence and partly because the societal system placed little value on the lives of enslaved people. By the time they began to pay attention, the brothers had already claimed multiple victims, and fear had firmly rooted itself in the hearts of those who knew them. What made these first deaths so terrifying was not just the number, but the intent behind them. They were deliberate, targeted, and carried out with eerie composure, distinguishing them from the ordinary violence of plantation life. To those who survived and later recounted the events, the brothers' actions seemed almost ritualistic, a chilling display of control that no one could explain. The early killings were a warning, though no one understood it at the time, a signal that these were not merely troubled boys, but men who had turned the lessons of cruelty into something far darker. Something that would eventually claim 35 lives before their reign of terror was stopped. The escalation of the brothers' killings was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, which made it all the more terrifying when the full extent of their actions was finally realized. After the initial deaths, the brothers became increasingly bold, no longer content with isolated victims or seemingly accidental accidents. They began targeting individuals with intention, watching the fear in their eyes as if it were a form of entertainment. Plantation records and later testimonies describe how the brothers would carefully study their victims for days, noting routines, weaknesses, and patterns. They moved with an eerie patience, their actions deliberate and precise, as if each killing were part of an unspoken experiment. It was as though they were learning, refining, and perfecting a process that only they could understand, and with each success, their confidence and cruelty grew. The methods they used to kill varied depending on circumstance and opportunity, showing a disturbing ingenuity. Some victims were strangled with ropes or cords found around the plantation, their bodies left in fields or near storage sheds. Others were struck with tools that were conveniently at hand, shovels, axes, or iron rods. But the precision of the strikes suggested more than random chance. In some accounts, witnesses later recalled finding the bodies arranged in positions that seemed almost intentional, as though the brothers had staged them to convey some message or satisfy some twisted sense of order. Those who survived these encounters often described the brothers' calm demeanor during the act, a chilling detachment that made the violence feel almost surreal. As the killings multiplied, the atmosphere on the plantation changed dramatically. The enslaved workers, who had once whispered among themselves about punishment and hardship, now whispered about fear itself. Fear was no longer simply about the threat of overseers or the punishment of disobedience. It was about the unpredictable presence of the brothers, whose intentions could not be predicted and whose actions were guided by an unfathomable sense of cruelty. People began avoiding them entirely, walking longer paths to avoid contact, hiding tools and weapons that might be used against them, and in some cases pretending to be sick to avoid being noticed. The sense of dread was pervasive, a constant tension that hung over every corner of the plantation. The escalation did not go unnoticed by the overseers or the plantation owner. Initially, they attributed the deaths to the harsh conditions of the fields, accidents or interpersonal disputes among the enslaved people themselves. But as the numbers climbed and patterns emerged, whispers of suspicion began to circulate. Some noted that the brothers appeared almost proud after a killing, displaying a subtle arrogance that was entirely out of place for enslaved individuals in a world that demanded subservience. It was this growing audacity that ultimately alerted authorities to the possibility that the deaths were not accidents, but acts of deliberate murder. Even then, intervention was complicated. Enslaved people were often not believed over the words of overseers, and evidence was scarce. The brothers were careful, choosing isolated locations and striking quickly to ensure no witnesses could intervene. They developed a strategy that minimized the risk of discovery while maximizing the psychological impact on the plantation community. Survivors of the attacks spoke of hearing strange whispers in the night, seeing shadows moving unnaturally, and feeling the gaze of the brothers even when they were not present. The acts of killing had become ritualized in some ways, a combination of cruelty, thrill-seeking, and assertion of power in a world where they had previously had none. By the time the pattern was undeniable, dozens of lives had already been lost. The sheer scale of the killings, 35 victims in total, shocked not only the immediate community, but also neighboring plantations once the rumors spread. Letters and oral testimonies later collected by historians describe the horror and disbelief that permeated the region. How could two young men, themselves enslaved and powerless in the eyes of the law, commit such repeated acts of violence without detection for so long? The answer, many concluded, lay in a combination of fear, secrecy, and a terrifying psychological detachment cultivated over years of brutal treatment. The psychological impact on the survivors cannot be overstated. Families who had been torn apart by the first deaths now lived in constant terror, knowing that the brothers could strike at any moment. Some attempted to flee, risking punishment or death if caught, while others fell into despair, paralyzed by the possibility that the next killing would be someone they loved. This escalation created a ripple effect that extended beyond the plantation's borders, instilling fear in neighboring areas and creating a legacy of horror that would last for decades. The brothers' actions during this period also revealed a chilling pattern of experimentation. Some accounts suggest that they tested different methods, observing the physical reactions of their victims and refining their approach. It was as if they were conducting a cruel study of life and death, a pursuit that combined opportunity, instinct, and a disturbingly cold intellect. Their ability to evade detection for so long added to their sense of power, reinforcing a cycle that led to even greater violence. In sum, the escalation of the killings was not random but methodical. It reflected a combination of environmental conditioning, psychological detachment, and deliberate intention. The first deaths had been accidents, or so they seemed, but the subsequent killings revealed a pattern of cold, calculated cruelty that marked the brothers as one of the most infamous and terrifying examples of unchecked violence in the history of Louisiana plantations. Their rise from mere participants in a brutal system to architects of systematic terror demonstrates how fear, opportunity, and human depravity can combine to produce events that haunt history for generations. The moment witnesses began to realize that the murders were not accidents, not the result of misfortune, but intentional and ritualistic, was a turning point that shook the plantation to its core. For years, the deaths had been written off as the harsh consequences of life in a brutal world, accidents in the fields, illness, the dangers of poorly maintained tools or livestock. But as the brothers' killings continued, subtle patterns emerged that could no longer be ignored. Survivors and fellow enslaved workers began to notice details that seemed far too deliberate to be coincidental. Bodies were often arranged in unnatural positions, placed with small objects nearby in ways that suggested a twisted sense of ceremony. Some were found facing the east, others positioned as if they were in mid-motion, and certain personal items, like a discarded shoe or a cooking tool, were carefully placed beside the victim. These repeated patterns hinted at an understanding, even an obsession, with the act of killing itself. The fear among the enslaved people intensified as they started to recognize these signs. They began sharing stories in whispers, comparing notes about the circumstances leading up to each death. A common thread emerged: the brothers were always near, sometimes appearing hours before a body was discovered, their presence unnoticed at first because of the long hours and constant labor in the fields. Many described the brothers moving silently, watching, observing the routines of others, and then striking at the perfect moment when no one else was around. Their actions suggested a level of premeditation far beyond what the overseers could comprehend. Some of the most chilling revelations came from the small moments that ordinary plantation laborers observed. A woman recalled seeing the older brother hum softly while sharpening a knife, a hum that seemed oddly melodic and unsettling at the same time. On another occasion, a child reported seeing the younger brother, draw strange symbols in the dirt with a stick, disappearing before anyone could question him. These seemingly minor details took on new meaning after subsequent deaths, as if they had been premonitions or warnings. The realization that the brothers might be ritualizing their killings, marking them with symbols, sounds, or positioning, transformed the perception of danger from a random threat to a calculated and inevitable one. Even the overseers began to take notice, though at first their observations were tinged with skepticism. One overseer, who had previously ignored earlier deaths as bad luck, documented in his journal a pattern he could no longer dismiss. He noted that the brothers seemed to select their victims carefully, choosing individuals who were isolated, weak, or unaware, and that the killings were performed with precision. The journal entry mentions a sense of choreographed violence, a phrase that would later be cited by historians trying to understand the psychology of the brothers. By comparing notes over time, it became evident that each death followed a particular ritualistic sequence. The method, timing, and placement of each victim appeared almost ceremonial, as if the brothers were enacting some private, incomprehensible code. The enslaved workers' fear became tangible. People began taking extreme measures to protect themselves and their families. They would avoid certain areas of the plantation entirely, travel in groups even when unnecessary, and constantly check on one another. Nights became particularly harrowing, as the brothers were rumored to wander the quarters silently, watching sleeping individuals. The mere sight of them could elicit paralyzing terror, their calm demeanor, unremarkable appearance, and quiet observation made them unpredictable and deadly. It was during these moments that it became clear the killings were not impulsive acts of rage or desperation. They were deliberate, practiced, and ritualized events that were being carried out to satisfy some need only the brothers understood. By the time the full scope of their violence was realized, the plantation's social order had fractured. Trust among workers eroded, whispers of curses and supernatural influence spread, and even the overseers felt the oppressive weight of fear. The rituals of daily life, gathering water, tending the fields, preparing meals, became exercises in caution, as everyone feared encountering the brothers at the wrong moment. The calculated nature of the murders imbued every corner of the plantation with a sense of dread. People began to speak of the look, the way the brothers would watch, silent and still, before a death occurred, a look that was now understood as a precursor, a warning sign of impending danger. The realization of the ritualistic nature of the killings also marked the beginning of attempts to intervene, though the danger was already high. Those who tried to protect potential victims or alert overseers often found themselves targeted. The brothers adapted quickly, changing their routines, becoming even more deliberate, almost like performers perfecting a grisly act. The awareness of intent made each encounter more frightening because it suggested conscious choice, an understanding of right and wrong, and a total disregard for human life. Unlike the random violence of the plantation, this was purposeful, methodical, and terrifyingly calculated. Ultimately, it was the recognition of ritual that drew outside attention. When news of multiple suspicious deaths reached neighboring plantations and local authorities, the stories of the brothers' calculated methods, their patience, their precision, the symbolic placement of victims, made it clear that this was no ordinary case of violence. It was deliberate, sustained, and horrifying in its scope. Witnesses' testimonies, combined with the patterns observed across multiple incidents, revealed a chilling truth. The brothers were not merely reacting to their environment. They had turned killing into an art, a ritual, and a source of power over life and death that few could challenge or comprehend. The moment witnesses understood that the murders were intentional and ritualistic forever, changed the atmosphere on the plantation. Fear became an omnipresent force. Trust among the enslaved evaporated, and even those in positions of authority realized that the danger was extraordinary. The killings were no longer isolated tragedies, but a coordinated sequence of horror that would culminate in the loss of 35 lives, leaving a mark on Louisiana history that would not be forgotten. The capture of the slave brothers did not come easily, and it was a process that involved both fear and a growing realization among authorities that these were not ordinary criminals. By the time plantation overseers, local lawmen, and neighboring community members recognized the scope of their crimes, the brothers had already claimed 35 lives, leaving behind a trail of terror that seemed almost supernatural in its consistency. Their ability to evade suspicion for so long had given them a false sense of invincibility, and they moved through the plantation and surrounding lands with an ease born of both cunning and intimidation. Locals described them as always present yet impossible to track, appearing silently in the distance or disappearing without a trace whenever someone attempted to confront them. This elusiveness contributed to the growing hysteria. The community began to believe that they were not just dangerous men, but embodiments of some malevolent force beyond human comprehension. The first real break in the case came when one of the brothers made a rare mistake. A minor slip in the careful orchestration of their crimes that left behind a crucial piece of evidence. A neighbor discovered a set of unusual footprints near the scene of a recent death, footprints that seemed deliberately aligned in patterns, almost ritualistic, yet leading toward the brothers' quarters. Investigators immediately began questioning enslaved workers who, despite the risk of punishment, spoke in hushed tones about the brothers' movements and the strange behaviors they had witnessed. These testimonies provided a foundation for understanding the method behind the madness. Although fear had kept many silent for years, the accumulation of stories revealed a disturbing pattern. The brothers had committed their killings with both planning and precision, making their capture not just a matter of physical pursuit, but of unraveling their psychological methods. Once authorities gathered sufficient evidence, a coordinated effort was launched to apprehend them. Several local lawmen and overseers approached cautiously, aware that the brothers' history of calculated violence made them extremely dangerous. They moved in under cover of night, armed and prepared, yet still faced uncertainty about what they would encounter. When the brothers were finally confronted, witnesses later described a scene of unnerving calm. The older brother reportedly met the approach of armed men with an almost eerie composure, neither pleading nor resisting, while the younger remained silent, eyes fixed on the ground as if calculating his next move. Their lack of visible fear shocked those attempting the arrest, reinforcing the idea that their detachment from human emotion had been a defining trait of their violence. After their capture, the trial that followed became one of the most infamous in the region, not only because of the sheer number of victims, but also because of the psychological horror revealed during testimony. Witnesses recounted the brothers' actions in meticulous detail, describing the sequence of murders, the careful selection of victims, and the chilling calm in which they carried out each act. Plantation records and personal diaries were submitted, along with testimonies from enslaved workers, overseers, and neighboring residents. The court was forced to confront a reality that few had anticipated. These were not crimes of passion or retaliation, but a sustained campaign of violence executed with methodical precision. The descriptions painted a portrait of men who had internalized the cruelty of the plantation system to such an extent that killing had become almost a perverse form of mastery over the world around them. The proceedings were brutal, exposing the depths of human cruelty and the limitations of the justice system at the time. In some cases, victims' families or fellow enslaved people were too traumatized or fearful to testify fully, leaving gaps in the narrative. However, the court recognized that despite these obstacles, the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated intentionality and premeditation. The brothers were ultimately found guilty of multiple counts of murder. The sentencing reflected both the need for justice and the symbolic necessity of quelling the fear that had gripped the community. Their punishment, while severe, could never undo the lives lost or erase the terror they had inflicted across the plantation and surrounding region. The legacy of the brothers' killings persisted long after their capture and execution. Families of the victims struggled to reconcile with the trauma, while local communities became hyper-aware of the potential for unchecked violence. Stories of the brothers' methods, their calm demeanor, and their calculated approach to murder circulated for decades, transforming them into both a cautionary tale and a dark legend within Louisiana folklore. Historians later examined the case to understand how such a level of violence could occur in a society already built on systemic cruelty, noting that the brothers' actions were amplified by the environment of dehumanization and normalized brutality surrounding them. Even today, the memory of the 35 lives lost serves as a grim reminder of the dangers inherent in unchecked cruelty and desensitization to suffering. The brothers' story has been recounted not only as a historical case of murder, but also as an illustration of how environment, psychology, and opportunity can converge to create unimaginable horror. Scholars and storytellers alike emphasize that while the plantation system provided the backdrop, the brothers' choices were their own, representing a deliberate descent into violence that left a permanent mark on the history of Louisiana. Their capture and trial may have brought closure legally, but the emotional and psychological scars endured for generations, embedding the story deeply into the region's collective memory. The chilling combination of premeditation, ritualistic behavior, and sheer scale of their crimes ensures that the story of the slave brothers remains one of the darkest chapters in antebellum history, a stark example of how cruelty, once internalized and left unchecked, can escalate into sustained horror, leaving 35 names etched forever into a tragic legacy.